Catherine Marguerite Beecham Waddell, known as Pat to her friends, was born in Cumberland in 1892. In 1912, she joined the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry after seeing a photograph of them in a newspaper. The First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, or Fannies as they were nicknamed, were a women's volunteer corps, and their training was to ride onto the battlefield on horseback to tend to wounded British soldiers before they were taken off to the dressing station. They were trained in veterinary skills, in signalling, in cooking, as well as in first aid skills. They had to pay a monthly subscription and to provide their own uniforms. The original uniform was a very garish red and blue number, which was replaced by a far more practical khaki one before the outbreak of the war. When the war breaks out in August 1914, the War Office flatly rejects all offers of help from the Fanny. Undeterred, Grace Ashley Smith manages to buy a motor ambulance, bearing in mind that at this stage in the war, the British Army have no motor ambulances, all of theirs are still horse-drawn. She takes the ambulance and 6 Fannies over to France on the 27th of October 1914 and immediately offers their services to the Belgian and French armies. And shortly afterwards, another batch of Fannies arrive, including Pat Waddell, who was hoping to be an ambulance driver, but in the absence of ambulances finds herself working as a nurse. Their hospital was an old convent, and they worked under pretty trying conditions, often under enemy shell fire. They treated cases as diverse as typhoid, gunshot wounds, and even those caught in the first German gas attack. After 13 months, the War Office finally relented and said that they were allowed to drive for the British Army. So on the 1st of January 1916, they took over the driving duties from the British Red Cross Society, and they formed what was known as the Calais Convoy. Despite the fact that they were now driving for the British, they were not part of the British Army. In fact, Surgeon General Woodhouse summed it up quite well when he said that they were impossible to categorise. He said, "They were neither fish nor fowl, but they were a damn fine red herring." And the Fannies took this to heart and had the red herring insignia painted on all of their ambulances. The Calais Convoy was stationed just outside Calais on a hillside and would drive to the front and pick up stretcher cases and return with them every day. Their ambulances were nearly all converted cars and lorries. Pat Waddell had one that she was particularly keen on. Her ambulance was called Susan and was a converted Napier car. This photograph shows Pat standing in front of Susan wearing a long goatskin French taxi driver's coat that she bought in France. She's also wearing these spats and puttees, and somewhere under those sleeves no doubt she's wearing these fur-lined fur driving gloves which would have kept her hands very warm driving in the winter. She's wearing the Fanny bonnet, but when the Fanny first went to France in 1914, they wore pith helmets because that was their uniform. Later, one of the Fannies turned up who'd just qualified as a pilot, and she was wearing an aviator's cap. And the fashion caught on, and very quickly all of Fannies went over to this style of bonnet. Towards the end of April 1917, Pat lost her lucky charm. She was also due to go on leave for 2 weeks, but swapped with one of the other women who needed to get home sooner. And on the morning of the 1st of May 1917, she was on duty and due to take stretcher cases down to the quayside for loading up for the ships for the journey back to Britain. The British had recently taken over the section of the dockside that she needed to travel through. And on the way, there was a level crossing, which was a very awkward crossing where there was a very high palisade fence and you couldn't actually see what was on the track until you were on the crossing. The French had always had a sentry posted there, but the British couldn't see the need because only ambulances used the crossing. She took with her a stretcher bearer, not a Royal Army Medical Corps stretcher bearer, but a French civilian who were paid to do the loading and the unloading. They got there okay, they unloaded, and the stretcher bearers would normally stay on the dockside and help to load. But unbeknown to Pat, this particular stretcher bearer jumped into the back of her ambulance for the journey back. When she reached the crossing, she noted again that there was no sentry. But the next thing that she remembered was being on the crossing and suddenly realising that there was a train only a few feet away. Had she been in Susan, the Napier would probably have powered across the crossing and just about made it. But the old Willys Overland truck that she was in had no go in it at all. And the next thing she remembered was being thrown out of the cab as the ambulance was punched out of the way by the train. She was then dragged along by the train quite some considerable distance until it stopped. The stretcher bearer was killed instantly. French soldiers rushed to her help and held a coat over her to keep the sun off her while they waited for doctors to arrive. 2 doctors eventually arrived from a hospital train and gave her a morphine injection, and then a French ambulance arrived to take her to hospital. And she insisted to be taken to the hospital that she worked out of, where she knew people. Several days later, they told her that she'd lost her leg, which came as a huge shock, as you can imagine. When she was fit enough to travel, she went back to Britain and recuperated there for the rest of the war. She tried to get some compensation, but it was a real battle. It turned out that you weren't even entitled to a prosthetic leg if you weren't a proper serviceman, so she had to pay for her own. In fact, she had to pay for 2 because you had to have 2 prosthetic legs in those days because they frequently needed repair. Just after the armistice, she returned to France and returned to the unit, carried on doing an admin role because the Fanny was still in France for quite some time. After the war, she became the adjutant and stayed in the Fannies to the 1920s. She married Peter Washington, who she'd met while she was convalescing, and they had 2 children, but the marriage didn't last. When the Second World War broke out, Pat wasn't allowed to go on active service again, although they did let her take a mobile canteen unit to France in 1940 to provide comfort for the troops. She was very proud of the fact that as the Germans were closing in, she pushed it off the edge of a cliff at San Malo before making her escape. She spent the rest of the war serving in a Fanny unit attached to the Polish army in Britain. And by the end of her service, she'd got awards from the French, the Belgian and the Polish governments. Unsurprisingly, Pat was very bitter about the way she was treated over her injuries. In particular, the fact that the government wouldn't compensate her for her prosthetic limbs. But she was a remarkable lady, one of only 420 members of Fanny who served on active service during the First World War, and one of only 2 of those who were awarded the French Croix de Guerre with Silver Star. And we are incredibly lucky to have some of her pieces of uniform in the Great War Huts collection and be able to tell her story today.